All right, this time we're going to test this bitch out and make sure it's actually recording. Speak.
Yoodle-a-hoo. Hey, whatever works.
Yodel for the people, Lee.
Yoodle-a-hoo.
Maybe never do that again. Okay. So, you want to hear about screaming mummies?
Yes, I do.
I can tell the enthusiasm on your face. It's just priceless. So, I'm going to tell you a story about the screaming mummies of Guanajuato. My voice kind of gave out there a little bit. Guanajuato, Mexico.
Excellent.
Excelente. Guanajuato is a city located in central Mexico. It sports numerous open-air areas, beautiful coral-colored sandstone buildings, a thriving university, and the Museum of Screaming Mummies.
So they actually make sound?
They look like they're screaming.
They got the, oh, look.
Yeah. I have to believe that if they were actually screaming, that they wouldn't get nearly as many visitors to the museum.
I don't know. I'd pay to watch that. And come in, have all these mummies screaming. That'd be cool.
There's something very wrong with you.
Isn't it supposed to be weird as fuck? That would be weird as fuck.
I meant the podcast to be weird as fuck, not my co-host.
You love me anyway.
So let's learn a little bit more about the home of Diego Rivera, a famous muralist. So when you look up the city of Guanajuato, the screaming mummies are one of the first things that you hear about. They're everywhere. You can't do a search online without seeing some reference to them. And that's because unlike the mummies that you see in Egypt and Egyptian collections, these mummies are absolutely unique in the world. They weren't preserved in advance. They weren't intended to be mummies. They weren't even sacrificed for any reason. These are just regular people who ended up in this horrific condition. So back in the early part of the 19th century, Guanajuato, like many other places in the world, was suffering from a cholera epidemic. Do you know what cholera is?
Oh, yeah. Killed lots of people.
It's a god-awful way to die. So in 1833, cholera swept through the town, and it's caused because of bacteria in untreated water. And it thrives in warm climates. Maybe in warm climates too. I don't know. My clients. Okay. But so in places in the equatorial regions, you used to see more of this. It wasn't as common in cold northern climates. Guanajuato exists just in that perfect sweet spot where cholera bacteria was proliferating in untreated water in these cities that were growing rapidly and maybe weren't disposing of their waste as effectively. And they had hundreds of people within the city that got sick from this disease. And if not treated well or not treated quickly, you can die within hours. Basically, it just runs through your body, and I won't go into the gory details, but
Why not?
yeah, because it's gross. It's really gross. I'm just going to leave it to your imagination. Basically, the bacteria ravages through your body, and the dehydration and the weakness and the bacteria kill you pretty quickly. And of course, this means that, like some of the diseases that we're fighting now, it's the weakest members of society that die first. And many of these weaker people are also in the impoverished sections of society. So you have the elderly who don't have people to support and care for them. You have young children. You have people who are living in close confines, who are using maybe not the cleanest water sources to prepare their food and to clean themselves. And they're the ones who are suffering the most. And that's an important point because poverty comes back into the story here in just a little bit. So throughout the cholera epidemic, you had hundreds of people that were dying, and they were being buried as quickly as possible. because the last thing that any thriving city wants are stacks of dead bodies along the roadway. So people were being placed in the ground, in above ground crypts, basically anywhere in the cemetery that they could put them, and as quickly as possible, because not only do you not want these corpses out for everyone to see, but rotting corpses help to spread bacteria, which makes the outbreak even worse.
Of course.
Makes sense. So, thanks to the cholera epidemic and the quick burials and all of the other things that we just mentioned, you had literally hundreds of people who are going into the ground pretty quickly. And this is good. But for many of these people that were going into the ground quickly, they were dealing with not the most ideal circumstances because they didn't have the money for a proper burial, for a sealed crypt, or for even permanent burial. Because in the village of Guanajuato, they passed an ordinance that you had to pay rent on your final resting place.
That's bullshit.
Can you imagine? Now, in some areas, like in New Orleans, they have crypts that are above ground, and there wasn't the intention that people would be put into these crypts permanently, because the environment in New Orleans causes a body to decompose and break down fairly quickly. And so you'd put a body in an above ground crypt, and within a year or so, they would be reduced to little more than dust. So you'd brush the dust out of the way, move the next resident in. In Guanajuato, it was greed. Plain, pure, and simple. So people who had the money to pay for permanent crypts, or who could afford this rental fee, stayed in the ground where they belonged. But the people who didn't, the people who were most likely to suffer from cholera, the people that were in impoverished portions of town who didn't have the money for a proper burial in the first place, obviously didn't. And in some cases, you'd have whole families that were wiped out by this disease. So in the middle part of the... I'll edit that part out. So that tax went into effect in about 1865, right around the end of our Civil War. And people who couldn't pay that were disinterred. And they were moved to a communal gravesite, basically dumped into a large hole where you'd have lots of people. And maybe now your ancestors are all in this communal grave and you don't know where they are.
Just a big mass grave that has nothing.
Exactly. But what they were finding was about, what workers were finding as they were disinterring these bodies, however, was that about 2% of the corpses didn't look the way they expected them to. They were essentially petrified. Mummified, stiff. They were the same color as the soil often, but they were preserved and stiff.
That's weird.
It was weird. They thought so too. So these bodies they would set aside because they had to be dealt with differently than the ones that had decomposed properly and could just be dumped in a hole. Well, people got curious when word of these strange corpses sort of leaked out, and they wanted to see. Because, like you, they're weird as hell. And the people who worked at the cemetery, the crypt keepers, for lack of a better word, decided that there was money to be made in this.
Yeah, there's always that thought.
Capitalism at its finest.
I want to look at them bodies.
Well, a lot of people did. And so these folks who were the grave diggers decided that they could make a few bucks, and if you were willing to pay them a few pesos, you could go have a peek.
Nice.
Yeah, nice. Really, really, really nice. Later on, a law was passed saying that this rental fee for the crypts was immoral and illegal, and they stopped digging people up. But they still had all of these dried out mummified bodies that they had already pulled from the ground, that they had placed in an empty crypt so that people would come take a peek. And they weren't quite sure what to do with them. So the enterprising city managers of Guanajuato said, well, if people are already willing to pay money to come see them, we should put them on display.
Of course.
Because nothing in the world says we respect our dead and we love our Nana like putting her naked body behind a glass shield so people can come see it.
Yeah, you got to make up the rental fees.
I suppose. So most of the bodies are relatively intact. Some of them are pretty horrifying, and a few are really, really heartbreaking. There are 111 bodies currently on display. One of the more famous one was Dr. Remigo Leroy, a doctor who had treated the cholera patients and contracted the disease himself because of close contact to the patients. And he was among the first to die. And so I don't know if it was because they placed him in a better part of the cemetery or just the luck of the draw, but his body was fairly well preserved and you can see it. Another was a young mother who contracted the disease while she was pregnant. Yeah.
That sucks.
And she and her baby died when she was about 6 months along. And both she and the fetus were mummified. And yeah, they put them both on display.
Well, of course they would.
But because of what cholera did to the bodies and because of how contagious the disease was, they often rushed to put people in the ground to make sure that the disease wouldn't spread, like I said earlier. And in at least one case, Ignacia Aguilar's, they thought she was dead. But when they dug her up, she'd tried to claw her way out. And they found her with a mouthful of her own flesh and blood.
Yeah.
Because they figured she'd gone mad trying to escape from her grave.
That sucks.
Yeah.
Not be a fun way to die.
I don't imagine any of it was fun at all. But my heart really bled for her. So, and that's obviously because when somebody is very, very ill like that, and like I said, cholera causes severe dehydration because you're vomiting and there's diarrhea. Yeah, I know I said I wasn't going to go into the gory details, but you need a couple.
It's not that gory.
But because of the severity of that, your skin takes on sort of a blue-gray pallor and your heart rate slows. And so it's easy to mistake somebody who has cholera, severe cholera, for someone who's passed on. And once your body goes into the ground, just like we talked about with the feet that it washed up in the Salish Sea, the tiny tendons that connect your jawbone to your upper mandible deteriorate quickly, just like the tendons in your ankle. And so your lower jaw comes loose first. And so these mummies, even though they're fairly well preserved, often they would find them with their mouths agape. And that gives you the horrifying appearance of this corpse screaming at you. Thank you for that illustration. Yes. So yeah, often they have these horrifying grimaces on their faces. And of course, all of the fatty soft tissues have rotted away. So you have these eyeless things that are screaming at you.
So they're still making money off those dead bodies after all this time.
They're still making monies, and they're actually on display. I have some pictures on the website that you can see of the museum.
That'd be a shitload of money when you think about it.
Well, when you consider that they've been paying, people have been paying to go in and see these corpses, these mummies, since 1865. So yeah, 155 years later. 160? No, 155 years. They've been charging admission. And I can't imagine there's a lot of upkeep on a mummy.
Yeah, it'd be a high profit margin, I would imagine. Just have to have somebody take the money and somebody do a tour, and that's about it.
Well, you don't even need a tour, because when you walk into the museum, you walk into a room it's climate controlled, obviously. And the mummies are all kept behind glass in a very restricted climate controlled area so they won't start to deteriorate. They're standing up, which is very odd to me to see it. They're sort of standing up and leaned up against the wall. And you can just walk along and gaze upon them.
How fun.
They haven't really done anything to, like with the Egyptian mummies, they clean them up and they're in their sarcophagus, and so you get an idea of what they look like. These guys just look like they pulled them out of the ground and leaned them up against the wall. They're still the same color as the soil. They're still dressed in tattered rags. And they're still pretty horrifying to look at.
Well, that's why they keep making money.
Yeah.
People like to look at sick shit.
Because people are morbid. We really are. And I think, I think there's some benefit to going and looking at mummies. Because it forces us to confront our own mortality. I don't have really any desire to do that. I know I'm going to die someday, and I'm at peace with that. More or less. But, yeah, I don't need to look into the face of somebody who's already passed on.
Yeah, but there's always something weird to look at, and you go, what the hell? Let's go take a look.
I can't say that if I was in Guanajuato, I wouldn't probably go by.
There's probably not a whole lot to look at there anyway.
Actually, it's a beautiful city. It's a pretty decent sized city, too. It's home to artists and painters and writers. And like I said, there's a thriving university there. And it's really a beautiful city. There's a lot to see and do. But the mummies are one of the top tourist attractions.
Of course.
So if you have a desire to see dirt-colored desiccated bodies,
that's the place to go.
Guanajuato has an amazing display. So yeah, that's the story of the screaming mummies of Guanajuato and Ignacia Aguilar, who died a horrifying death and tried to eat her own arm.
Tasty and nutritious.
That's just nasty.
Yep.
Yeah. Look, waveforms.
Wow.
I know. It sucks to talk about bog bodies for 15 minutes and realize that we weren't recording anything.
Oh, well.
That's okay. That just means I'm gazing at you instead of the screen.
Ooh.
It's a pity that eye roll didn't make any noise for people. Okay. So, this story is all about Toland Man.
Who is he?
Well, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. Toland Man. So, when most people think of mummies, they think about the screaming mummies of Guanajuato and Egyptian mummies. Dried out, desiccated corpses that have been left in hot, arid regions. Not about bog bodies.
Sounds gooey and nasty.
It does, doesn't it? But it really isn't. Surprisingly. I thought it would be kind of gooey and gross too. But no, Toland Man was found not in Egypt, not in Mexico, and not even in a dry, arid section of the world. Toland Man was actually found in Scandinavia.
Weird place.
Yeah, it's not the first place that I think of when I think of mummies.
Wouldn't even think of it.
No. I mean, Otzi was found, in the Alps? So,
Cold.
Right. Well, he was frozen into a glacier.
That makes sense, yes.
But this was actually where people live. So, Toland Man. The story of the most famous bog body in the world. It's like the Beatles of bogmen.
Okay.
So, our story starts in May of 1950. A family in Denmark, and I'm going to butcher the name. I've practiced, but I'm not doing it right. I know I'm not doing it right. I'm going to call it Beistovel. It's an area located approximately 3¾ miles or 10 kilometers west of the city of Silkeborg, Denmark.
Okay.
And if anybody from Denmark is listening to this right now, they're banging their heads against their desks, wondering, what the hell am I doing?
Kind of like the Oregon and Oregon.
It's Oregon.
Yep.
For everyone who's listening, Oregon. And Washington. There's no R in Washington. Please stop. Anyway, back to our bog barn. So in 1950, folks were still using peat to warm their homes in the wintertime. And peat we've used in the garden. We've used
I wouldn't think it would burn well.
It actually does because of the way that the material has been compressed into the ground. It's sort of like, it's almost like sandstone. So you know that sandstone is made because we have layers of sediment that come in.
Mm-hmm.
Sedimentary rock that are washed in. No, not layers of sedimentary rock. Layers of sediment that are created under pressure to create a rock. Wow. I went to college. I really did. I promise. Anyway, so peat is kind of the same sort of thing. It's layers and layers of organic material that are under pressure for centuries that create this really dense sort of material that can be used like our fire logs that we go and we purchase from the store. You know, those fake ones that are made from sawdust and wax.
Yep.
That stink up your holes.
Burned many of
them. So peat is a similar substance. That's a really rudimentary explanation, but that's kind of what it is. It's smoky, but it burns slowly and it burns hot. So it's a really good source of heat for people who live in more cold northern regions like Denmark. It was used extensively in Ireland and Scotland to warm homes. And if you go into homes now, like the older cottages that have been around for a long time, you can still see the blackened ceilings from all of the soot and smoke.
Nice.
But this is 1950 and people are still using it because in Denmark, the winters are really, really cold. And this is a ready source of heat. And, obviously it's also harvested and shipped abroad for people like us who need to supplement their soil with something that's a little bit more nutrient rich and a little less dense than the clay that we have. So these folks, however, were just digging it up because their families had for a very long time to warm the homes. In fact, they'd been digging in this particular area for so long that they had channels that were about 2 meters deep. So that's about 6.5 feet. And it was in one of these deep channels that they found a body.
Surprise.
Not a pleasant one. That's exactly what I like to find when I'm working on a Monday morning is a corpse, in a hole with me. Can you imagine how horrifying that would be?
I think it'd be kind of cool.
See, I don't. I'm one of those people, though, when I'm driving along and I see like garbage bags on the side of the road, my first thought is there's a body in there, but I'm not stopping. I do not want to be the one to find the body.
You just have to hit it with a stick.
I've always thought that it would be kind of interesting to find a body because it means that you're helping to solve a crime. But I really don't want to find a body. There are many reasons why I don't hike in the woods. None of them have to do with wild animals. I do not fear wild animals. I fear humans and corpses. I don't want to see them.
Never found one. I've spent lots of times in the woods hunting.
I'm amazed. I would think that you would be like one of the...
I thought I might find one. But found stuff dead, but, it's all these wild animals of some sort.
Is that what you're on the lookout when there's no game to be found? You're like, maybe there's a body out here. If I were a serial killer, I'd have buried somebody right there. Let's go look.
I know where all the good hiding places are.
Good Lord, that's twisted. Back to our story. So in this 2 meter deep channel, they find a body. And naturally, they freak out because there's a body. So they climb out of the channel and they spend about a day, according to the story, trying to figure out exactly what they need to do next. Because it's not a common occurrence. You don't usually wander upon corpses in your day-to-day. They finally settled on calling the police and letting them know that they had what they thought was potentially a crime. So the police came to investigate, and initially there was some suspicion that it was a young man who'd gone missing in Copenhagen about a week before, because not a lot of violent crime in this part of Denmark. So the police climb down into the channel, they do a brief investigation, and they realize that this body isn't current. This isn't somebody who's been in this hole for a little while. This guy's been down here for a bit. And he's not the first one that they've seen like this. So they contacted the museum because they know the museum has had experience with bodies pulled out of the bog. And they suspect that this might be someone from antiquity and that these are the best folks to deal with this. So they come out and they investigate. And the police were right. In fact, Tolenman would be the third body that they pulled out of this bog in recent years, recent to them. So the first one had come out in about 1927, and then they found another in 1938. And like Tolenman, they all had minimal signs of violence and were incredibly well preserved considering how long they'd been in there. And it took them a little while, but they were able to determine, based on how deep he was in the bog, the materials that he had with him, and the way that he was dressed, that Tolenman was a Bronze Age man, and that they estimated he'd been in the bog for about 2,400 years.
I thought they could figure that out from the bones or the skin and blood or something, by how old it was or something.
They can now. We can do carbon-14 dating to date the material, and I think that probably went into part of making this estimation, because 2,400 years, people dressed and looked pretty similar for a very long time. So it's, it's more recent, our recent generations where our styles are constantly changing. But, back in the Bronze Age, people would have dressed the same way for generations. The hat you're wearing could have been great-grandpa's hat,
Not anymore.
No, not anymore.
Everything's different every week.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the 80s. So there was they used carbon-14 to date the material around Tolenman, and they've recently been able to take some other samples and determine, using DNA testing, who he was and where he was from. And, obviously they can't put a name to him, but they do know that the estimates were, approximately correct, 2,400 years. But when they had initially found the body, he still looked fairly lively. I mean, his skin was plump. It was discolored because of his time in the bog, but he still looked very much like a person. He wasn't a mummy. He wasn't decayed. He had some damage to some of his extremities. But even now, and there's a picture of him on our website, even now, he just looks like he's sleeping. He looks very peaceful, which led investigators at the museum to wonder, well, this man has obviously died a violent death. He didn't just keel over one day. So, how can he look so peaceful? And so they started doing some digging. And they learned that in the area, in the time of the Romans, that it wasn't uncommon for criminals to be hung in full view of the public as punishment for violent crimes. Thieves would be hanged. Murderers, obviously, would be hanged. But often these bodies were left out on public display. Tolenman obviously had to have gone into the bog not long after he died, or we would have seen some decomposition.
Yeah, you'd think stuff in the bog would eat parts of it or something too, but apparently not.
You would think so, but the bog is actually surprisingly weak in bacteria, the kind of bacteria that break down the human body, and they're oxygen depleted. So things that go in there are better preserved than things that are planted in normal ground. In fact, they found some butter that was being stored in the bog because people used it to preserve food as well. And the butter was centuries old. It was something like 1,000 years old or something like that. And there was talk of some chef wanting to use it to cook. I don't know if he ever actually did, and I'm afraid to find out. But
Well, anything preserved, just throw it in a bog.
Well, in fact, Joshua Levine, who writes for the Smithsonian Magazine, explains that the unique chemistry of the bogs are like this. A body placed here decomposes extremely slowly. Soon after burial, the acid starts tanning the body's skin, hair, and nails. As the sphagum moss dies, it releases a carbohydrate polymer called sphagon. It binds nitrogen, halting the growth of bacteria and further mummifying the corpse. But phagum also extracts calcium and leaches it out of the body's bones. This helps to explain why, after 1,000 or so years of this treatment, a corpse ends up looking just like a squished rubber doll. So if you look at the pictures of Tolan Man, like I said, he looks like he's sleeping, but his face is ever so slightly distorted. And that's because the bones of his face are softer. So the pressure of the moss over time squished it just a little bit. And his body isn't as plump as it was when they pulled him out, obviously, because they pulled him out of the bog and he was no longer filled with all of the fluids from the bog that had been, inflating him. So he does look a little bit squished, but still remarkably intact. It's pretty amazing. So, like I said, Tolan Man died during the Iron Age when the average life expectancy was just 26 years old. And of course, that number is skewed because so many children died in infancy and when they were very young. So you had people on the other end of the spectrum that were older, but a lot of people died very young. Tolan Man, however, was 40. Wow, so respectably middle-aged.
That's like an old man to be like 80 now.
Yeah, and by all accounts from the examinations that they've done, he was actually in pretty good shape. He was a healthy man. So he probably didn't die by some sort of medical malady. So why did he die?
He did something bad and they killed him.
Well, that was the initial thinking. Was he a criminal or was he an enemy of the tribe that was executed? But anthropologists think probably not. See, there are no written records from the residents of the time. And as I said, scholars do have records from letters written home by Roman soldiers that talked about the executions of criminals. But they also have evidence that during times of famine and drought, human sacrifice was still practiced in these areas.
Nice.
Which the Romans called these people savages for this reason, among many others. We'll get into the Romans and why that might have been a little pot calling the kettle black later. But anthropologists believe that bodies executed as Tolan Man, let me back that up a little bit, that unlike a criminal that was executed and would show signs of obvious trauma, bodies like Tolan Man's, who are found resting on his side in the fetal position in a very peaceful pose, were probably sacrificed for the benefit of the village. In fact, Tolan Man, they believe, went into the bog towards the end of winter or the beginning of spring, at a time when maybe there wasn't a lot of food to go around. And yet Tolan Man's stomach was full. He had obviously eaten porridge and nuts and berries from the area, which is unusual when you consider there probably wasn't a ton of food to go around. And if you're going to execute somebody, you probably would want to feed them first.
Yeah, usually you starve them instead.
Well, yeah, why bother taking care of them if you're just going to lynch him and throw him into the ground? But Tolan Man, as I said, was well fed. He was still wearing good clothing, what was left of it that we can tell from the examination. And he was peaceful. The way that he was placed into the ground was in a position that one would place a loved one. He was cared for. So anthropologists believe that rather than having been executed for a crime, that Tolan Man had been chosen as an honorable sacrifice for the betterment of his tribe. He was a gift to the gods in the hopes that it would bring good harvests and plenty for the entire village.
Yeah, that always works out well.
Yeah. How much would that suck to be the guy that everybody liked, and because everybody liked you, we're going to kill you and put you in a bog?
Yeah, we like you, but you're old. We're going to go throw you out in a bog.
Yeah.
Good luck.
So it's kind of, there's something to be said for being the asshole, I suppose.
You think those would be the first people that they would throw in the bog?
Yeah, but if you send somebody that everybody hates to the gods, then the gods are going to get mad, right?
Yeah.
So you pick somebody who's agreeable, someone who would honor you when they meet the gods. It reminds me of the witch trials, where they throw you in the water, and if you sink, you were innocent, and if you float, you were a witch, and they're going to kill you.
So either way, you're fucked.
Exactly. So, yeah, I couldn't find a lot of information on how the sacrifices were chosen. And of course, that's just speculative, but I would imagine that you don't choose the guy that would embarrass you in front of Odin. Odin was a Viking god. That's the wrong god. I'm sorry.
You'd always think that they would take a knife and stab him and kill him.
And that is actually
do
what
that shit
happened.
to 'em.
Like I said, in Druidic sacrifices that they found in Ireland, I've read about sacrifices being made on the same person in a variety of ways. So they would strangle you, and they would stab you, and then they would slit your throat. So, you're going to die. They want to make sure
And
you're
make
going
sure
to die.
you're gonna be dead.
But Tolan Man, as unique as he is, because like I said, he's the most well-preserved bog body in known existence. If you look at the images on our website, you can see just how unique he is. And although he does obviously have a leather garrote around his neck, his death was seemingly peaceful, which leads some anthropologists to believe that he was an honored sacrifice and not a criminal that was killed and tossed willy-nilly into the bog. But honestly, we may never know for certain. But until then, we have Tolan Man and other bog bodies to give us a peek into what ancient civilizations may have actually been like. And that's a little weird if you think about it. Want to stay connected between shows? Find us on Instagram at WeirdAsFCKPodcast, on Facebook at WeirdAsFCKPodcast, on Twitter at WeirdAsFuckPod1, they're a little bit more open-minded, or on the web at www.weirdasfck.com. There you can check out our blog, get more information on each episode, pick up some merch, send us ideas for future shows, or share your own weird experiences. You might even make it on a future episode. We would love to hear from you. Until then, tune in and keep it weird. Are you entertained? Step on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Your 5-star rating helps to boost us up in the listings so other podcast listeners can find the show.